There's something very important I forgot to tell you.
What?
Don't cross the streams.
Why?
It would be bad.
I'm fuzzy on the whole good-bad thing. What do you mean bad?
Try to imagine all life as you know it stopping instantaneously and every molecule in your body exploding at the speed of light.
Total protonic reversal.
All right, that's bad. Okay. All right, important safety tip. Thanks, Egon.
In June 2009, Harold Ramis, the legendary filmmaker who wrote, directed, and even starred in some of the most influential comedies of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, from National Lampoon's Animal House to Ghostbusters to Groundhog Day, sat down for an interview with the AV Club, an online entertainment news site best known for deep dives on some of the more esoteric and hip brands of comedy. Ramis was primarily interested in promoting his latest film, Year One, which he wrote, produced, directed, and acted in alongside an all-star cast including Jack Black, Michael Cera, Oliver Platt, Bill Hader, and more. But as was typical with the famously friendly and avuncular Ramis, the conversation was wide-ranging and covered numerous topics about his incredible career, which by that point had spanned more than 3 decades. He'd spent time with and worked with some of the brightest minds in comedy, from John Belushi to Chevy Chase to Rodney Dangerfield. But perhaps his most fruitful collaborations had been with SNL alum turned versatile leading man Bill Murray. The two had an obvious affinity for one another, feeding off each other's offbeat comedic personas and generating some of the best movies of the 80s and 90s along the way, including Murray's breakout performance in Meatballs, his star turn in Stripes, their hilarious turn as supernatural exterminators in Ghostbusters, and perhaps Murray's greatest role as a TV weatherman stuck in an existential time loop in the Ramis-directed Groundhog Day. They were perfect comedic foils. Ramis usually played the more cerebral smartass with deadpan wit, while Murray perfectly complemented that energy with a more extroverted, energetic brand of goofiness. If you've ever seen Ghostbusters, you can see the dynamic on full display, and the snappy rapport between Ramis' Egon and Murray's Venkman really does provide the beating heart of the movie. But things had grown frosty since Groundhog Day, amidst rumors and reports of a serious rift between the two friends on the set, which had metastasized into a full-blown estrangement. There was speculation that Murray wanted to branch out from the broad comedies of his younger days to explore quieter and subtler roles, which he would do in projects like Lost in Translation, Broken Flowers, and numerous projects with hipster film darling Wes Anderson. The simmering resentments and creative differences reportedly bubbled over into serious arguments on set, including one in which Ramis uncharacteristically lost his temper and grabbed Murray by the collar and shoved him against the wall. The argument proved fatal to their friendship, which was essentially non-existent for the next 20-plus years. The famously private Murray never fed the negativity in the press, but Ramis was more forthcoming in this interview when asked about working with Murray again, saying, quote, "I have no idea. We have no social relationship whatsoever. It'd be hard to predict." He added, quote, "I've had many dreams about him that we're friends again. There was a great reunion feeling in those dreams. You'd do a movie with Bill, a big comedy in those early days, just knowing he could save the day no matter how bad the script was, that we'd find something through improvisation. That was our alliance, kind of our big bond. I could help him be the best funny Bill Murray he could be, and I think he appreciated that then. And I don't know where that went, but it's there on film. So whatever happens between us in the future, at least we have those expressions." It was a heartbreaking revelation for comedy fans, who looked up to the two comedy icons and openly wondered about how many funny movies never happened as a result of the rift. Less than a year later, Ramis contracted a serious infection that resulted in complications from a disorder known as autoimmune inflammatory vasculitis, a rare disease that involves swelling of the blood vessels that feed blood to all of our vital organs. The serious infection even caused Ramis to lose the ability to walk, and although he recovered for a short time, he suffered a serious relapse of the disease in late 2011. And just a few years later, with the disease progressing rapidly, Murray, encouraged by his older brother Brian Doyle Murray, finally visited Ramis to make amends with his longtime friend and collaborator. In typically irreverent fashion, Murray arrived at Ramis' Chicago home with a box of donuts and a police escort. By this point, Ramis had lost most of his ability to speak, so Murray did most of the talking. It didn't matter. The two men shared so much history, nothing really needed to be said. The gesture itself was everything. And on February 24th, 2014, Ramis died from complications related to the disease. Harold Ramis was just 69 years old. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, Harold Ramis.
Given his illness, Ramis' death was not entirely unexpected, and many of his closest friends and family members did have an opportunity to say goodbye to the legend. A private funeral was held 2 days after Ramis died with family, friends, and his countless comedic collaborators. Dan Aykroyd, Chevy Chase, Eugene Levy, Dave Thomas, and the widow of John Belushi, among many others, attended to pay their respects. Aykroyd in particular adored Ramis and would speak about him glowingly in interviews, crediting his Egon character in Ghostbusters as one of the linchpins in making the movie.
It wouldn't have been the movie that it became without Harold, no doubt about it, Again, his intelligence, the breadth of knowledge that he had about quantum physics and spiritualism and myth, all the way through the material.
And of course, after mending their rift shortly before his death, Bill Murray made sure to give Ramis a brief, impromptu tribute at the 2014 Academy Awards while presenting the award for Best Cinematography.
Oh, we forgot one. Harold Ramis for Caddyshack, Ghostbusters, and Groundhog Day. Please forgive me, gentlemen.
But the passing of Harold Ramis sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry, reverberating far beyond the tightly knit comedy circles he was perhaps best known for during his career. Stephen Colbert paid tribute to Ramis on an episode of his late-night show, The Colbert Report, saying that, quote, "As a young, bookish man with glasses looking for a role model, I might have picked Harold Ramis." And even then, President Barack Obama released a statement on the passing of Ramis, saying, quote, "When we watched his movies from Animal House and Caddyshack to Ghostbusters and Groundhog Day, we didn't just laugh until it hurt. We questioned authority. We identified with the outsider. We rooted for the underdog. And through it all, we never lost our faith in happy endings."
Derek, I think it's a good time to stop and talk about how much Harold Ramis meant to you personally.
Yeah.
I've known this since you and I met, about how important he was in your life. I think you and I met right about the time of his death, right? He died, you started when? In May of 14?
Yeah, 13.
13. So it was
been
a
here
few
less
months
than
later that he died, and we sort of bonded over that. We were both huge fans of Caddyshack, especially for me is a big one, the Ghostbusters movies, and so many others. But he was a lion of comedy, one of the greats up there with the 2 or 3 or 4 other directors that have done the most for comedy and pushing it forward.
I think that's right. When you're looking for a comedy icon, you're looking for someone who shares a sensibility with you. And he had that blend of some ironic detachment, but some goofiness. And that really always resonated with me. If you watch Ghostbusters and you watch Animal House and you watch Caddyshack, those movies are joyful. They're not overly sarcastic. They're filled with like the type of irony that I enjoy most. I think Bill Murray owed him a huge debt, and he's one of our favorite comedians. Whenever he's in a movie, you're in store for a ride. And when I read about their rift, it made me very sad because I remember when Bill Murray departed to do serious films. And look, I like Lost in Translation. I like what he did with his career, but I miss the old Bill Murray after Groundhog Day.
Well, it's just sad that their friendship had to get an end. He could have gone into those projects while still being friends with Harold Ramis. Didn't require it, but Ramis was the greatest. I mean, a movie, Caddyshack means as much to me as any movie does from the first sort of 2 decades of my life. And I know Groundhog Day, which we'll talk about, means as much to us as any movie ever. And so
and he was the best at collaborating. We'll talk about him a lot, but he would not put himself always on camera. Egon's a great character, but he's not the lead of Ghostbusters. No one's favorite character is necessarily Egon, but he loved being in an ensemble and letting other people shine. And that's what made him a great director.
So Ramis wasn't just lauded after his death. He was celebrated during his lifetime for his myriad accomplishments and contributions to comedy and entertainment. He received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Chicago Improv Festival in 2010, and he won numerous writing awards for his screenplays. He was also posthumously honored by the Writers Guild of America for his lifetime achievement in screenwriting, and the Second City Improv Troupe honored him in 2016 with the Harold Ramis Film School devoted solely to film comedies. And perhaps most fittingly, the city of Chicago itself declared that every February 2nd, going forward, would no longer be named after a rodent prognosticating seasonal changes, but would rather be known as Harold Ramis Day in honor of his groundbreaking film.
Let's go ahead and take a quick break. More on the legacy of Harold Ramis when we come back. In the pantheon of the most influential comedic voices of the past half-century, most people would probably not think of Harold Ramis, but this strikes me as more a function of his understated and humble persona than a reflection of his contributions. When you stack up his filmography with the classics of the genre, think of all the movies released by Mel Brooks, Woody Allen, the Farrelly brothers, Rob Reiner, and Ivan Reitman, Ramis really does stand shoulder to shoulder with all the all-time greats. His name belongs right there with these giants, even if he was less interested in becoming a self-mythologizing auteur like Woody Allen, or the crown prince of slapstick like the Farrelly brothers, or even an impish and irreverent absurdist like Mel Brooks. Whereas many other big names in comedy became synonymous with a singular brand, Harold Ramis was more of a collaborator, unlocking the talents of the individuals around him and merging his voice with their genius. In this way, I think of Ramis as the precursor to someone like Judd Apatow. There's undeniably a comedic voice at the center of most Apatow projects, which is usually the stunted growth of a well-meaning but immature man-child. But Apatow used that structure to platform the talents of his leading men, like Seth Rogen in Knocked Up, or Steve Carell in The 40-Year-Old Virgin, or even Jason Segel in Forgetting Sarah Marshall. He didn't just stuff himself into the movies like Woody Allen, where everything basically becomes autobiographical, or even like Mel Brooks, who inserted himself, or at least a strong current of his comedic sensibility, into many of his silly parodies. Ramis did the same with his leading men, ultimately launching them into the upper echelons of fame and fortune without taking too much of the spotlight for himself.
Ramis was a Chicago kid through and through, although his first foray into comedy came in the form of writing parodic plays in college at Washington University in St. Louis. He would later say about the experience that, quote, "In my heart, I felt I was a combination of Groucho and Harpo Marx, of Groucho using his wit as a weapon against the upper classes, and of Harpo's antic charm and the fact that he was oddly sexy. He grabs women, pulls their skirts off, and gets away with it." After cutting his teeth in comedy during his college years, Ramis returned to Chicago, writing freelance pieces for the Chicago Daily News while studying and performing with Chicago's famed Second City improv comedy troupe. It was his years at Second City that introduced Ramis to some of the brightest upcoming stars in comedy at the time, including John Belushi and Bill Murray. We talked about this in Gilda Radner, right?
We did. What a scene in comedy at that time. And
you have Aykroyd and Murray and Ramis and Belushi all sort of rubbing elbows against each other. I mean, obviously SNL's coming up. It's a huge time for that as well.
And they're forming sort of the modern comedy landscape, and Ramis was right there with them.
Ramis was even offered a gig as a writer on SNL, but chose to stick with its competitor, SCTV. This was back when it was genuinely an open race for which show would reign supreme. And Ramis was getting important parts on SCTV, including a friendly but fascist cop character named Officer Friendly, and a memorable impression of Leonard Nimoy's Spock in Star Trek parodies.
This season on SCTV, a diner in the future where the food gets dished up at warp speed. It's two of your Star Trek favorites, Spock and McCoy, starring in a new situation comedy called Check Please.
Spock! Where the hell are you? Maybe Vulcans like their food cold, but just about everybody else in the galaxy likes their food hot.
Doctor, casual observation would indicate that I only have two upper appendages. Perhaps a more efficient system of food preparation would facilitate my distributive function.
I suggest you exercise your distributive function, Spock, by getting your lower appendages in gear. Now get that anti-gravity soup and those meatballs over to table 4.
But Ramis was never the center of attention. He didn't seem to want to be the focus and compete with the blinding charisma of Belushi and Murray, and it seemed like he realized he was more suited to playing in the ensemble and perhaps even directing the action.
Ramis left SCTV to pursue a film career, and it would be hard to identify someone who came out of the gates stronger than Harold Ramis. His very first script was co-written with National Lampoon's Douglas Kenney and Chris Miller, and eventually became Animal House. The film was a smash hit, raking in $141 million at the box office and smashing records for R-rated comedies at the time. And the success of the film, which helped launch the post-SNL career of John Belushi and others, immediately opened doors for Ramis. He next co-wrote the summer camp comedy Meatballs, which gave Bill Murray his first starring role and essentially launched his career.
Even if every man, woman, and child held hands together and prayed for us to win, it just wouldn't matter, because all the really good-looking girls would still go out with the guys from Mohawk because they got all the money.
You know, Jason, the movie's an interesting time capsule. You've seen Meatballs. We've all seen it, but it's not a movie that many people revisit. It probably doesn't stand up to modern comedic standards, but as a showcase for Murray's unique and distinct charm, it was an incredible proof of concept that he could carry a movie as a leading man.
I saw it later after I knew who Ramis was, and I was certainly very aware of who Murray was and a huge fan of his, and doesn't compete from a movie-making standpoint to those others. But Murray is undeniable.
He's undeniable,
He's a force on screen, and you see how it was that he became the star that he became because he is incredible in that.
He's electric, and he's like a sort of a camp counselor, rousing speeches, the whole thing. And Ramis followed up Meatballs with his directorial debut, the golf comedy classic Caddyshack. So you've got Animal House, followed by Meatballs, and now Caddyshack. These are three stone-cold classics, and he's a young man just right out of the gates. This marked his first time working with Chevy Chase and Rodney Dangerfield, who he would work with again to great success in National Lampoon's Vacation and Back to School, respectively. Of course, his old buddy Bill Murray turned in another memorable performance as greenskeeper Carl Spackler, tasked with killing a destructive gopher in Caddyshack.
As I said earlier, my personal favorite comedy, maybe of all time, definitely my top 3 or 4. I love that movie. To have the first 3 movies under your belt be Animal House, Meatballs, and Caddyshack would be more than enough to mint one as a comedy royalty. But Ramis wasn't finished yet, and remarkably, it could be argued that the best was yet to come. First, he starred along Murray and Dan Aykroyd in a pair of Ghostbusters movies in the 80s that grossed more than $500 million at the box office and have become cemented in comedy history. His character, Egon Spengler, gives the movie a level of scientific credibility that pairs perfectly with the snarky one-liners delivered by Bill Murray's Peter Venkman throughout the film. There have been a handful of recent sequels that have performed decently well, but only remind you how important the original cast was in making these deeply weird but funny movies actually work. Such high-concept stuff.
Yeah, the original Aykroyd script, if you ever Google it, was very, very out there.
So he wrote the first script and then partners with Ramis.
And then Ramis sort of corralled it. And Ivan Reitman as well. So it really became sort of the classic it did through a true collaborative effort.
Second, Ramis delivered his stone-cold masterpiece in the form of a romantic comedy about a cynical weatherman trapped in a time loop that forces him to relive the same annoying day in Puxatawney, Pennsylvania, over and over again.
It's Groundhog Day!
Groundhog time.
1,000 people freezing their butts off waiting to worship a rat.
Weatherman Phil Connors is spending the day in Puxatawney, Pennsylvania.
Phil? Ned Ryerson, I did the whistling belly button trick at the high school talent show.
Bing!
Bing!
Groundhog Day is more than just a memorable Bill Murray comedy and one of the top-grossing films of 1993. It's actually an important film. Today, it's considered one of the greatest comedy films ever, and the concept of Groundhog Day has become firmly entrenched in our lexicon as a phrase to describe a monotonous and unpleasantly repetitive situation. In 2006, the film was even selected for preservation in the National Film Registry by the U.S. Library of Congress, and it has been adapted into a musical and even a video game in the years since its release. There's a strange bit of poignancy that this film that has become so important to both the legacy of Harold Ramis and Bill Murray was also the source of the personal falling out that robbed them of 20-plus years of friendship and professional collaboration.
Here's one more fun fact about Groundhog Day, which I've always loved. If you think it was only Murray's genius that was critical to Groundhog Day, there's a great story about a scene in the film told by Stephen Tobolowsky, who played the annoying insurance salesman Ned Ryerson in the movie. Everyone remembers Ned, Needle-Nose Ned, that whole scene.
Yep.
There was a scene where Murray's character realizes he's living in a world with no consequences, and he spray paints his room at the inn, cuts his hair into a mohawk, and chainsaws the place, knowing things would revert to normal by the morning. It was an expensive scene, and it took 3 days to shoot, and everything had to be rebuilt and restored to make it work. But you probably don't remember the scene because it didn't make it into the movie, because Ramis ended up throwing it all out and cutting it out of the movie. Instead, he replaced the scene with a simple shot of Bill Murray breaking a pencil into 2 pieces and putting it on the nightstand. When he wakes up, the pencil is whole again. And this, to me, was the essence of Ramis. He was understated. He was brilliant. He knew that this whole scene with mohawks and spray paint was unnecessary to the story. All Bill Murray, who was kind of depressed, had to do was break a pencil, and if it was together again, it meant he was in the time loop. And I thought that was just brilliant because he had to stand up to the studio and say, "You've wasted 3 days, but it doesn't belong in my movie," and that's why the movie stands up.
There's a couple frantic moments in the movie, like when Bill Murray's trying to commit suicide and jumping off the train bridge and everything else. But most of the movie is him interacting with Ned Ryerson, the different ways he does that, him trying to learn French poetry and learn the piano in order to woo and impress Andy McDowell. And this is just one of these incredibly subtle scenes. It didn't need, he was looking for laughs, and I get that, and he didn't need this over-the-top scene. And he realizes that, and the pencil scene is so perfect. He constantly wants to remind the watcher of the monotony of the time loop that Murray is caught in, and it's perfect.
It is. It really is. Tonally, he just knew what kind of movie he wanted to make, and he nailed it. And I look at that movie, and I see 2 friends who are perfectly in sync. It's sad that there was this rift behind the scenes.
It's like you and me, Derek.
Yeah, exactly.
2 friends totally in sync with rifts behind the scenes.
But we can make a beautiful podcast. And despite their unfortunate rift during the production of Groundhog Day, the movie has become an absolute classic, looked back upon fondly by virtually anyone who's seen it. And time and death have a way of softening any hard feelings that may have developed between Murray and Ramis on the set. Ramis put it best during that interview towards the end of his life, reflecting on the lasting imprint of their magical chemistry on film despite anything that transpired between the two of them on a personal level, behind the camera lens, when he said, "Whatever happens between us is in the future. At least we have those expressions." Though it may have taken Murray a bit longer to come around, they did share that brief reunion during the last days of Ramis's life, and Murray has consistently showered his late friend with praise ever since, including this tribute to Ramis on a recent Groundhog Day, when Murray shared some brief and of course humorous words about his friend at an event celebrating the movie and career of Harold Ramis. And so I thought it only fitting to give Bill Murray the final word.
I think it's great that we're here, and I think it's nice to have, I don't want to be too Irish, but it's very nice of Harold to make us a nice mild day for today. He's up there stirring the clouds around and making that low pressure move out over to Indiana and just drench and ruin those people's lives over there in Indiana.